a drug ring in the Bay Area had been selling cocaine, and part of the money was going to Central America to buy weapons. The drugs were being sold in the ghettos of Los Angeles to the Crips and the Bloods, who turned it into crack. Freeway Rick got his nickname Freeway because there were a lot of Ricks. You know, there were fat Ricks, skinny Ricks. There were so many Ricks that he called himself Freeway Ricky so that people would recognize him. Freeway Rick Ross, in this documentary, he sues Rick Ross, the rapper, for stealing his name because he thought that he was buried. He thought that he wouldn't get out of jail, and he got out of jail and he sued him. Rick came home. When he got out of jail, his mother's house was foreclosed on. Rick vowed to take care of his mom. His uncle tried to kill his mom. She shot him dead after the incident where he knocked out her eye. In the movie, in the beginning, the mother explains how the uncle attacked her with a broom and knocked her eye out. And so she told him not to come near her anymore. She wasn't going to take any more of his stuff. And he came near her and she shot him dead in self-defense. So Rick Ross, as he's out of jail, he goes around to children, schools, groups, prisons, and he tells them that he is responsible for bringing crack into Los Angeles. He is the main person who's responsible for it. He takes responsibility. Before Rick started selling crack, he wanted to play tennis. Tennis brought a relief to Ricky. Rick was told not to play tennis. He should be selling crack. You know, they didn't tell him he'd spend 20 years in prison and not be in his family's life. Rick was illiterate up until he went to jail. Ronald Reagan was president. There were very little jobs when crack arrived in Los Angeles, California. There wasn't an economy. Rick saw the movie Superfly. This made him want to sell cocaine, so he started selling cocaine. They started with 300. Rick's girlfriend helped him. His girlfriend reminded me of Cookie on Empire, except on Empire they sell music. Rick's friends helped him sell drugs. Mike Levine was an undercover cop. He worked with a Colombian woman who was under Pablo Escobar. She told him about pitacata, which was cocaine base being smoked in Bolivia. It's addictive. It went to America. It became crack cocaine. 1980 was the first time Rick Ross and friends seen crack. Rick Ross started cooking it up because freebasing was too slow for customers. The Crips officially turned cocaine into crack. So Rick Ross was actually a gang member. He was a Crip. And he was the one that started turning cocaine into crack. So the Crips assisted in turning cocaine into crack. They came up with this thing called Ready Rock, which is crack cocaine. People would be ready to smoke this crack. Rick wanted to run LA and be respected. Anybody in the 80s used dope or smoked dope. This is the United States' fault. This was a statement that a guy gave in the movie. He said anybody in the 80s, smoked crack. And it was the United States' fault. Los Angeles, 1983. Rick would hang out with a teacher and he gave him some connect to Nicaraguans. Rick did not get high. He moved fast. He made quick moves. The connect showed Rick where the locations were, the products would be. He showed them guns, weapons, and money. So the Nicaraguan connect had locations in Los Angeles, and he showed Rick the guns and things that he would need to protect himself while he's doing the drug trading. So the Contra connection, let's talk about that. Rick kept moving up the fast track because, like I said, he would sell this dope and it would sell out fast. He would start off with 300. If you started off with 300 and you went to Rick Ross to buy crack, you would bring him 300. He would give you the crack and you would end up with $900. So he moved up the fast track and he met Delio Blandone. Delio Blandone was the most important person to Freeway Rick Ross. Delio would meet Rick down the street. He'd give them a signal before Delio. Rick and his friends were just street hustlers. So before Rick Ross met Delio Blandone, they were just street hustlers. He put them on the map. He gave them money, weapons. Rick made at least $20,000 to $30,000 a day. Blandone, according to Coral Becker, he was very educated, very nice. He was not flashy. He was believed to be the White House connect. Blandone told Coral that his family was prominent in the government. Now, Coral had an uncle, and her uncle had family that were prominent in the government. And Blandone was a government informant for the federal government. And Coral had family that were in the Nicaraguan government. So at the time, before they were ousted by the Sandinistas, which are a campaign group that ousted the people that were in Nicaraguan government. The Sandinistas came in and kicked them out. So the Sandinistas were led by Daniel Ortega. They overthrew the Nicaraguan dictator Ernesto Somoza in 1979. A Contra movement was backed by Ronald Reagan. Reagan was anti-communist. Reagan was a Contra. The Contras were rebels fighting the Sandinistas and backed by President Reagan. The Contra Revolution was sponsored by the United States. Reagan, anti-communist. The Contras were rebels fighting the Sandinistas and backed by Reagan because they committed human rights violations and had little popular support. Congress cut off military aid in 1985. The Contras supported themselves by selling drugs in the U.S. The Contras sold drugs because they were patriots. They wanted the country back. So the Contras, who were Nicaraguans, they decided that they would sell drugs in the U.S. to fund their army to take back over in Nicaragua. So Congress made some connect with this Nicaraguan government and these patriots, and they allowed them to sell drugs in order to fund their army so they could get back their country, because their country was overran by drugs. So Congress said, okay, you can sell this pita cotta, which is crack cocaine. You can sell it. Just find somewhere to sell it. So Gary Webb, who is a media person who actually committed suicide, he basically said that one guy said, well, we're getting into the black thing. And he said, well, what do you mean the black thing? He said, we're selling crack in the black neighborhoods because there's no police there. There's no, you can sell anywhere you want to without being caught. And this was 1980. So what I got from basically this is the Contras, backed by Reagan in the Congress, said, okay, we can let you sell crack. We don't care who you sell it to. And the Nicaraguans that were here in America said, let's sell it to the black people. See how that went? So Danilo Blandón was the government's informant. He was the one that said, let's sell it to the black people. So the Nicaraguans went to dumping their drugs in LA, and they had a frogman bus, which was the first major case to connect Contras with drug trafficking. Money was given for Contras. So while the allegations might be entirely false, there are sufficient factual details which would cause certain damage to our image and program in Central America. And this is a note from the CIA. Basically, the CIA was backing the Contras for selling drugs in Los Angeles. And they were selling it to blacks. So Julio Zavella, he got sentenced to 10 years for having drugs on him. Gary Webb talks about how one person talks about getting into the black thing, meaning they were selling drugs to blacks. And I've already mentioned that. So Gary Webb, he committed suicide, and he said the media basically he swept this under the rug. They didn't want people to know that the CIA and the federal government were the reason why crack cocaine was on the streets of Los Angeles. So Blandón is the government informant that's selling drugs for the CIA. He talks about a kid that he meets named Freeway Rick Ross, who lived in LA. He knew the gangs and the system. Rick got the drugs from Blandón, and it would all be gone in an hour. So Rick Ross knew the gangs because he was a gang member himself. And he would take the drugs that Blandón would give to him, and he would give them to the Crips, and they would cook it up, and they would sell it to their people. So one of Ricky's friend was asked to fly drugs in and out of the U.S. for $8,000, and he declined. He said that, they made millions traveling around the world. And the one thing I saw in this movie was They made all that money, and all they did was travel around the world, and they did not buy any houses or any property. He thought about being a motel owner, but he never bought the motels. Now, Michelle Alexandra was in this movie talking about her. She said that she stated that a vast new social control has emerged. She states there are more people in prison and jail today just for drug offenses than all reasons in 1980, the war on drugs, and it's called The New Jim Crow. I haven't got this book yet, but I'm going to get it. From what I've seen in this movie, Ronald Reagan, and he knew that they were selling drugs to Los Angeles, the blacks in Los Angeles, the Crips were selling drugs. He knew this. They basically set this up. They knew about it. You know, Delio Blandone was an informant. And he was the one that was connected to Freeway Ricky Ross. And that's how the drugs got into Los Angeles. And the media denied it. They denied this. They denied it. And George Bush and Ronald Reagan then started to crack down on drugs, and they started to write the laws about drugs. And basically, if you were caught with 100 grams of crack, you could get 10 years in jail. So this is where these laws were made. So they had a politician in the movie, and he said that they knew when they wrote these laws on drug trafficking that these laws were terrible laws, because these blacks in Los Angeles were getting 10 and 15 years for small amounts of crack. Okay, so Rick went to prison, and he was illiterate. He came out knowing how to read. Rick studied law. The 1986 law created a 100-to-1 disparity between sentencing guidelines for crack and powder cocaine. This is when Reagan and George Bush started to make all of these drug laws, war on drugs. And then after George Bush Sr., then this is when Bill Clinton came in, and he started to usher in the same laws to locked up majority of African American men who had anything to do with crack cocaine. So Ricky meets a cop in the movie that was investigating him in the 80s. And he basically told Ricky that, you know, we were surveillancing you. We didn't really care about you. We cared about the connect, where you were getting in it from. And Ricky asked him, he said, so y'all knew the whole time? He said, yeah, we knew. But he said the police chiefs wanted the police to go out and get more money, so they would have to bust all these black people in Los Angeles to get the money off the streets to give to the federal government to fight the Contras. To give to the Contras to fight the Sandinistas. And Reagan was backing that. So Ricky Ross, he got 100 years to life. And Blandone didn't get anything. Who is the government informant? He didn't get anything. So Ricky went into jail. Like I said, he was illiterate. He taught himself to read. And he got his sentence decreased to 20 years instead of life. They were going to give him life because he was the only one that they could get a hold to. They couldn't get Blandon because he was working with the federal government. You know, Ricky Ross and his co-defendant brought this up in court, and they didn't want to hear none of that. They didn't want to touch that. The media didn't want to touch it. The judges didn't want to touch it because they didn't believe that the United States government put crack on the streets. They didn't believe that. So Ricky got 100 years. And he, as I said, the judge, when he looked at his case and he went up on his case on appeal, the judge gave him 20 years instead of 100. So Rick Ross, he gets out of jail after the first time that he went to jail. He stayed in jail for a while. He gets out of jail and he tells everybody that he is going to straighten up. He's not going to sell drugs anymore, and he is going to be in his children's life and stuff like that. Well, he goes back out and sell crack cocaine again, and this is when he got the 100 years to life. So let's talk about in the movie. In November 1986, the Iran-Contra scandal threatened to undermine the Reagan presidency. It was revealed that administration officials sold arms to Iran and diverted some of the funds to the Contras. Both were prohibited by Congress. Blandon was let out of prison. Rick Ross was their target. So Congress stopped funding the Contras, who were the ones that were selling drugs in America, which is how Rick Ross got a hold to the drugs. Congress stopped funding that program. So they used the Iranian government, that they seized their money from Iran and they gave it to the Nicaraguans, who were the Contras. And this is big stuff right here. And it's just amazing in this movie how history is just... And I get to, when you look at this movie, if you've lived in the 80s with a parent who ever smoked crack, like, you know, I have, my father was a smoke crack. So, in the 80s, it was hard. It was hard and things were crazy. Things were crazy. So when I got to look at this movie, it just brought up a lot of memories when I was younger. But I know this story good because my father always talked about this story. Talked about how the government did put crack cocaine on the streets. My father's from Baltimore, so he always talked about this. So this is true, but the media will never tell this story. The media didn't want to touch it. The media lied. And the only media person that actually took this story and wrote about it was Gary Webb, and Gary Webb committed suicide because nobody believed him. So, as I said, drugs were used to support the Contra. Rick did not know what Contra was. So rappers were telling you in hip hop what was going on in the streets at the time. They said crack. They sold crack to survive. The rappers brought their drugs through Ricky Ross. So any rapper at the time in LA who sold crack, they went to Ricky Ross. So Rick said a lot of his friends started to tell what they were doing, and this is how a lot of them started getting arrested, because a lot of his friends started to be informants for the cops, and that's how everybody started getting arrested, and the FBI started coming in, cracking down, and this is how all these laws got passed. So in the movie, it shows when Ricky gets out of jail at first, and he tells about his family life, and he talks about his friends, and he starts getting teary-eyed and he starts crying, because he said that everything that went on with himself, his family, and his friends was his fault. So this lady named Coral Becker, who, as I said earlier in the movie, her uncle had prominent people in the Nicaraguan government. Before the Sandinistans came in, the Nicaraguan government, she had connects there. So Coral calls Gary Webb, a reporter, to tell him that her boyfriend was in jail for selling drugs on behalf of the CIA. Coral gave him sealed documents, sealed court documents. And Gary Webb asked her, "How did you get sealed court documents?" And she said, "I can't tell you that." So Rick was talking to Gary. Blandone was a government informant, as I said, for the United States government. The news came out that the Reagan administration was flooding South Central with drugs. People were angry and they were protesting at the time. So they had a rally in LA, and they had a CIA agent there to answer questions. And the CIA agent says, in the movie, well, the CIA fights drugs. We don't encourage drugs. So he says, in the movie, they're saying, well, the government just came up with an idea. They didn't care where it was sold. They just came up with the idea, let's sell this crack so the Nicaraguan government can raise money to get their country back, to fund their army, to get their country back. These were patriots and Nicaraguan patriots who were selling drugs because their country was overran by drugs. So they used drugs, sold them so they could get their country back. So they were patriots, Nicaraguan patriots. So Blandone was paid $160,000, but Rick Ross went to jail for 100 years. So this right here is unfair. It was very unfair. When you look at the movie and you're like, how did this government informant, he get paid $160,000 and Rick Ross and his co-defendant go to jail? So Gary Webb, who is the investigative reporter, he was on the Montel show, and he made an assumption, and he said that the crack thing was only a black thing, and one man said to Gary not to make it only a black thing because his daughter was a crack addict and he was a Jew. So this was a statement that was made on the Montel Jordan show at the time when it was airing. The media would not admit the government was involved. Gary Webb committed suicide. Rick thought it was the CIA that got to Gary Webb, but Gary Webb's wife said that Gary would drop clues on his suicide before he committed suicide. So they found he was dropping clues before he committed suicide. This movie, was eye-opening, and it brought back a lot of memories. And it's something that applies to today. When you hear Donald Trump talk about a wall, this is what he's talking about, to keep the drugs out of America, because the drugs got here in 1980 because of the Reagan administration, Rick Ross, and Delio Blandon. So with today, this movie is relevant for today. It should be in your library. If you have a Netflix subscription, this is one movie that you need to watch 2 or 3 times to understand what's going on right now in your community, because drugs are still flooding America. It's not only crack cocaine anymore. It's opiates, it's fentanyl, it's PCP, it's still coming in here through the border. This is why you see Donald Trump talking about border and immigration, because he knows the Reagan administration messed up. Because Donald Trump is running on Ronald Reagan's slogan. If you go back to Ronald Reagan campaign, Ronald Reagan was the first one saying, "Make America Great Again." Ronald Reagan was the one that messed up. He knew for a fact that the CIA were assisting to put drugs on the streets in LA, and they started in LA. And then in the movie, it tells you that crack was only in 4 states. Then it was 5 states, 6 states, 7 states. It started to go everywhere. So they kept track of how crack cocaine got on the streets, how drugs got on the streets. So we have a big problem right now, and this is the beginning. So if you want to know how drugs got on the streets in America, this would be the best documentary to get a hold of. So look at this documentary. Tell me what you think. Like, share, subscribe. Salon B. Have a great day.